welcome back to the Sparks by Ignium podcast. I'm Phil Rose, your host, and today I'm joined by Julie Kratz. Julie runs a business called Next Pivot Point, and she is a diversity trainer and speaker. So I'm delighted to have her on here because we want to talk about culture. And often we talk about growing the value of a business and talk about running a better business. We talk about actually, let's get the culture right in the first place. So you know where you're aiming at and you can get the right people on the bus to deliver the value for the future. Even if you never want to sell your business, it makes your business a better and a nicer place to run. So Julie, welcome to the Sparks by Ignium podcast. I introduced you there as a diversity trainer and speaker. We're going to talk about a lot more about that, but what does it mean in a nutshell?
Oh, thank you for that question. Yeah, I mean, when I think about diversity in terms like equity and inclusion, ones that get thrown around in the States here where I live quite a bit, it's really about diversity of perspective. I think oftentimes when we hear the word diversity, a lot of times well-intentioned white men might think, oh, well, I'm not diverse, quote unquote. And it's like, well, no, I mean, we all have our own diverse perspective we can bring to the conversation. And a lot of times it just gets labeled as race or gender, non-white or male or, other the pieces of the gender spectrum, but there's way more to the diversity conversation. It's your background, your experiences, the voice that you bring that others may not have. And we know with diverse teams, they just simply outperform teams that are not as diverse.
And I think that's one of the big points. A lot of the work I've done over the last 15 years has been around making businesses better places to be. And I also talk about, we grow the value of businesses. And then I would say, even if you never want to sell. And when we talk about the model of growing value, we talk about, if I imagine a pyramid, the thing that's at the base of the pyramid is that foundation. And I talk about, the talent, the capability, and the culture, getting the right people on the bus who want to be part of your journey. And I think so many businesses have struggled with this over the years about who do they want on the bus, who do they need on the bus, and how they build that diverse mixture. And I think this is one of the key things. And a lot of my work now is around how do you bring the humanity back to business? And we talk about purpose and say that, the key people I want to work with are those who want to build a business that has a purpose above and beyond making money. Because I know that if you do that, you're also going to build a better business. But yes, you'll make more money. You can invest into better causes in the future. But if your purpose is just about money, you're not likely to get that key thing for you. So diversity, I think, is one of the key bits there. So for me in that case, let's start at the beginning. How do organizations deepen their knowledge of what diversity means? Because we've heard a lot about it over the last 10, 15, 20, 30, 40 years, but still people don't get it. Where do we start?
No, I think there's a natural defensiveness that comes up in the conversation. I talk about it as a zero-sum game mentality, which just simply isn't true. A lot of times people will say, well, if we want to increase diversity, then we're going to have to let go of people that are already here. Or somehow there's going to be less seats for people that aren't quote unquote diverse. And that zero-sum game mentality, my pie slice versus your pie slice, it's just not how it actually works. The pie gets bigger and there's more seats at the table for more people when you have diverse teams. And we were talking about numbers like a 21 to 36% profitability lift.
Wow.
And that's based on McKinsey's data. They've studied this for a number of years, and they find with gender and race alone against industry peers. So when you bring more people in, especially that senior leadership team, oftentimes, again, here in the States, we call it, pretty male, pretty pale, sometimes a little stale. Because you're really just getting like the same ideas, the same perspectives around a meeting room. And, we can just do better by bringing in a few more voices. We're not talking about ousting people and making room, but just bringing in some more voices and being really intentional. The companies that are really successful at this are very intentional. They're very consistent over time with this. And that senior leadership team, especially that CEO, is actively engaged in this conversation.
Yeah. And it's interesting you say about being intentional, because I think this is one of the things I've seen, if I bring in this word purpose, a lot of people talk about purpose, but they just pay lip service to it. And I think you talk about, you mentioned equity and inclusion, diversity and inclusion. I think in the past, people have just paid lip service to these words because they thought it's what they have to do, what they should be doing. So when you talk about 21 to 36% profitability increase just through gender and race alone, that's a big incentive. that people should be paying attention to. But actually, more than that, they should just be doing it anyway. So
Yep.
the money's one side, but actually, if you come back to my phrase, bring humanity back to business, actually, it should just be the way we run our businesses.
Agreed. Yeah, Phil, I talk about it as the business case and the human case. And literally, when I'm presenting this content to organizations and helping them be more inclusive, it's two sides of the same coin, right? I start with the business case because like it's people's attention. There's innovation data, decision-making data, profitability, revenue data. I mean, there's no shortage of data that shows the business case for this. And that data honestly has been around for a long time and hasn't changed anything. My hypothesis on that is the reason it hasn't changed anything is because humans are motivated by emotion. And the human case is where I really want leaders to dial in. So I share my own human case, which is a drawing my daughter drew shortly after the murder of George Floyd, and just a lot of way overdue racial reckoning here in the States and around the world. And she drew a picture of her asking a kid of color to be her friend. And it just struck me as like, wow, like she sees this as additive. Like,
wow.
She sees this as like a natural, like, I want to be your friend. Like, I don't want to be, a white savior necessarily, but I think she really saw it as like, I want kids that are different than me. I want to be around diversity. And I think back to your point about humanity, I think somewhere along the way, as we grow up, we lose that interest in difference. We learn to judge difference rather than be curious about it. And we kind of find ourselves in groups that are much mirrored in who we are. And that childlike curiosity, if we could just stay curious a little longer, right? And so that's my coaching to leaders. Like, just stay curious a little longer rather than think, oh, why did they do things this way, not the way I do it? Well, like think about like just stop there. Like, why do they do it that way rather than think about your way versus their way? That's the beauty of differences, is that when we look to differences, we can learn something versus when we're just looking for things we have in common or similarities, we're just reinforcing what we already know.
And you use that phrase, pale, stale, and whatever else it might be. In fact, I heard it on one of your, so I forgot to say to listeners as well, Julie also runs a podcast, which we'll talk about later. So I listened to your podcast, and one of the episodes, you actually talk about exactly that phrase as well. So I think this is saying, and we've used the same phrase in the UK. It says, a lot of the boardrooms in the past have been that pale, stale, middle-class white Englishman. And there is a change. We are thankfully seeing more women on boards. We're seeing more people of color on boards. We're seeing more inclusion, but it's not there yet. There's a barrier to change there. And we've seen a big shift over the last year in the way the pandemic has changed people's outlook on the world. But that point there about your daughter, additive, can I come back to explore that? Because I think that's one of the key things. And I think, young people today, I've got two young kids, 15 and 18. I think they see in the world in a very different place to I do it. I was 50 last year. And I don't look it, thank you for saying. But, at the end of the day, 50 is just an age to me. I don't feel 50. I feel like I'm 21. I sometimes try and act like that as well. So age, I think, is it's dependent on who you are, but actually it's a mindset. But I look at my children at 15 or 18, and I do think they see the world very differently. They have a different set of eyes to see the world through than we do. I was brought up in the 70s, and I often say to people, I was brought up in the 70s by parents of the 1940s. So their mindset, their view of the world was very much that 1940s late war era. What's your thoughts on that in terms of, the way we see the world, see it as it is rather than the way we want to see it?
Yeah, well, you're right. Generational thinking, which is, by the way, a dimension of diversity, is this whole generational component. There's some remarkable data on Gen Z, the latest generation to come into the workforce. And I use this data a lot when working with clients because it again goes back to the business case. They increasingly, your daughter's generations, identify as, is gender non-binary, is recognizing gender as a spectrum rather than just male and female. And the best data too is that north of 70% of them demand diversity and inclusion in their workplace. So they're not willing to compromise that, at least for now. I think I was a late millennial. And I think I entered the workforce with that same expectation, just kind of got beat out of me over time. But millennials tried and they're like, gave up to the baby boomers, right? It was like, all right, fine, I'll just keep working and do it your
Yeah.
way. But now is what we really are starting to have an exodus of that huge generation of baby boomers, Gen X now leading
Yeah.
and stepping into those leadership roles. And Gen X are kind of rebellious, they kind of have, at least here in the States, the more independent mindset,
Yeah.
open to change. And millennials certainly have been beating this drum for a long time, and Gen Z. So I think I'm cautiously optimistic about the
Yeah.
future because we have kicked the can to future generations many times before. I think to your point, yeah, Gen X, millennials, however you look at generations, we've thought like these kids are going to change it all, but they still inherit the structures and the systems that unfortunately work
Yeah.
for one demographic way more than another demographic. So those systems have to be changed. And those systems were built to keep certain people in power. They're not easy to change overnight.
And that's interesting because that's quite a shock to me when I hear that. And so, those systems would be built to keep certain people in power and certain types of people in power. And I think we see that. And we in the UK look at the world, from a UK centric point of view, and you in the US have that view. But I think that same trait exists across wherever you are. The systems we've got. Can you tell me a bit more about that in terms of the way those systems emerge in business, rather than look at it from a political angle, looking at it from a business
Oh,
angle?
yeah. Yeah. I mean, I
What
think
do you
people go,
see?
yeah, you're right. I mean, people go to like politics, like, I can't influence that. That's so big. And I think this is the whole conundrum of the space that I'm in with diversity, equity, inclusion,
Yeah.
self versus systems, right? I talk a lot about how you can be an ally and be there for people and lead from where you're at as an individual within yourself. But there's this whole like obvious thing, these systems need to change. And what that looks like inside a typical organization is really every element of the employee experience. And I know this is near and dear to your heart.
Mm.
It's everything from how they're recruited to how they're hired, to how they're promoted, to how pay is decided, and ultimately separation. And of course, there's more experiences. I'm simplifying it here.
Yeah.
But when you peel back the onion and just the recruiting and hiring process, I have clients here in the States that only recruit at Ivy League schools, the fancy schools that like just, you know, clearly there's a socioeconomic privilege and a high correlation demographically with those schools. So despite the best of intentions, these systems that have been set up
Yeah.
really aren't built to embrace
Yeah.
diversity and be inclusive. And sometimes it's a painful process to come to terms with, like, we've got to change how we do things. If we want diversity, by definition, we have to do things differently.
Yeah. Yeah.
And I think that's why we've seen such a slow tick in diversity, because these systems have not changed. These systems are ingrained in people's minds. And at some point, they've got to be, you got to take a close look. You got to rattle. You got to change things a little bit, whether that's simply the schools you recruit from,
Yeah.
the qualifications that are required or not required, also send major signals of who we want and who we don't want. But every part of the employee experience, one of the clients I was very fortunate to work with, Salesforce, a big customer relationship management company globally, a big tech company, their CEO went on the record to say, we did a pay gap audit. I thought, there's no way we have a pay gap between men and women. Well, it's like $3 million the first time they did it. Then they did it again, about another 3 million gap. I think to date, they're close to 20 million in what they've discovered, because they've realized how regularly they have to audit it. And that's like putting your money where your mouth is, right? And I don't think a lot of companies are there yet.
Yeah. So there's a whole load of things in there, and you're talking about there. So just that thing about Salesforce and doing that audit, it takes a lot to stand up and do that. And we've seen it in the UK. The BBC is one of the media company in the UK that we all pay our taxes to fund, and people would have different views on that. But they've done a lot around what does it mean in terms of women presenters, but also looking at the pay per presenter. Now they're an organization who are governed and regulated by in the UK, so they have to show it. But even so, we're seeing lots of differences in their pay. But the bit you mentioned there, which really struck me, we said about where we're hiring from. So in the UK, of course, we've got Oxford and Cambridge are the two big universities. So a lot of people will talk about we only hire from certain schools. You mentioned Ivy League in the US. There's an elitist element to some of those schools as well, just because of the cost to go there and the way they've been brought up over the years. And we're seeing some change in the UK around that now. There's been talk recently of various people, Stormzy for one, funding individuals from Black and ethnic minority areas to go to university because they couldn't afford it in the past. So there's pop stars making money and then saying, hey, we need to change this. But this point around people actually going out to recruit from certain areas because they believe that's where they get the right story. That then goes against what you said earlier. I'm just flicking back on notes there. You said about when we're children, we want to look at things and be said childlike curiosity, and not doing it the same way as I've always done it, trying to find other ways of doing it. So surely that's the integral piece. We need to find out a way of just saying, hey, this person could do it differently with me. It will achieve a result. It may be different to my result, but it's a result.
Well, the status quo is so easy to reinforce. And another human trait, I mean, back to humanity, some of the natural things we're wired is to keep things the same so that we feel safe. And as human beings, when there's saber-toothed tigers and we were like truly in a primitive state, that was helpful thinking because you might die or get attacked by another tribe. Don't eat those berries. But now doing things differently is actually a very positive thing.
Yeah.
But our brain still goes back to that like hard wiring. I've seen it done this way 20 times. That's the way. That's the way. And with diversity, it really requires you to rewire your brain, create new pathways, and that requires a lot of energy. And I mean, I joke with people, I'm a hard worker, right? I when I was in corporate, I worked, very regular 10-hour days and weekends and things. Like I earned my stripes. And that's unfortunately like a badge of honor here as an American, like work hard, work all the time. But now running my own business for the last 7 years, I'm at a point where I work about 6 to 7 hours a day during the week, and I don't work on the weekends. And sometimes I even take an extra day off. And the reason is the mental energy to stay in that curiosity and learning mode and to have really hard conversations about social change and systemic change inside organizations. It takes a lot out of me. I think like 1 hour of this work is like the equivalent to like 4 or 5 of like just doing a project. Some days I'm like, I just want to like do a project that doesn't require like a lot of thinking and a lot of unthinking, the unlearning too that's required. So it's hard. And I think that's why going back to youth, it's easier to do that earlier in life. And by no means, if you're older like me, you can still do it later. It just, it's kind of exhausting. And it's a continual muscle you have to build too. Like some days I'm like, I've arrived, I've got it. And then you slide back into that status quo mentality. And part of it's just fighting our own humanity and that wiring and being open and really intentional, back to that word, intentional about welcoming change.
Yeah. And I think that's a really interesting point, isn't it? That intentional about welcoming change, because, we have to challenge the status quo, in any business. When we go into a business, in what I do, a lot of the time is, it's about challenging the way they run the business in a good way, to say, okay, have you considered this? And before you and I started talking officially just now, I mentioned about the book I've read, which is, Why We Sleep. And when you talked about the corporate world, doing the 10-hour days, actually, we need to challenge that as well, because that's not good for society. We know that businesses can do better when people get more sleep. And when you look at the facts around sleep, we know that those people who sleep less are less rational as well. So the conundrum in my mind now is we've got a lot of underslept people, if that's the right word, that's a strange word, underslept people who are coming into business to run the business and making irrational decisions. And if they are not getting the sleep they need, then they're making snap decisions based on their original map of the world. And therefore, they're not going to be challenging the status quo because it's hard work. So actually, there's almost this thing that we need to be challenging the hard work ethic of multiple hours in a day and saying, how do we deliver hard work from a point of view of productivity? And I think people could make a better choice around diversity and inclusion because they would say it's worthwhile.
No, I think you raised some really good points there. I mean, just like the rhetoric we have around sleep and mental health and well-being, it's been so unhelpful over the years. Like sleep when you're dead, it's just I can totally see that connection with emotional intelligence and short-term thinking too. I think one of the things you're drawing out here is, when people make snap decisions, they're almost always short-term decisions, not decisions that are going to, stand the test of time. Long-term is that back to that instant gratification. And when we're sleep deprived and not taking care of our mental health and working too much, we make a lot of those short-term decisions. And all you need to do is look at Wall Street and how
Yeah,
decisions are made about stock price, right?
exactly. Yeah.
And that's also one of the underpinnings of why diversity is such a slow trickle, because it's a long game.
Yeah. And I
Right.
think
So investing in it, you're not going to get the results next quarter or next year, but like 5 years from now, probably going to see some great change.
so interesting. That comes back almost full circle to my view about purpose again, and challenging that notion about purpose is just about adding shareholder value. When I did my MBA 20 odd years ago now, we talked about Milton Friedman and think that purpose of business was to increase shareholder value. And there's been a big move around that. And I've mentioned this on the podcast before, that back in 2019, 181 US businesses signed up to a charter to say that they were going to challenge that. They were going to look at purpose above and beyond making money and do things differently. But the point there is, you may get short-term lack of profit, but actually the long-term will be better. So somebody has to make a stand and say, we're going to do this for the good of the world, for the good of humanity. And I think that takes courage for a lot of CEOs who are having to challenge the way the business runs, or more importantly, it takes takes courage for those who are not the CEO to challenge the CEO to say, we can't do it like this anymore.
Yeah.
We need to be doing something differently. And that's a cultural shift.
Yeah. And if you have diverse perspectives around that table, that's more likely to happen too, that long-term view.
Yeah. But I guess only if you've got those diverse perspectives in the first place. So as you said earlier, the baby boomers are moving on. Actually, the Gen X, Gen Y, and Gen Z is coming through. Actually, we've got a different type of person in there now who can make different decisions and see the world differently in some cases.
Yeah. Well, another point that's really, I think, essential to this conversation, to build up on what you said, is thinking about corporations and organizations as driving social change. So there's a lot of evidence that shows, you look back in history and how things were changed, outside forces. It's really hard to politically change things. I mean, again, those systems are set up with checks and balances and things that we didn't want a lot of change, at least here in the States. It's very hard to change things politically, especially at a national level. But what's easier is you look within the walls of existing organizations. And if you can drive social change, and this is a real call to action for the, big global, especially global companies. I mean, talk about doing the right thing. You want to reflect your customer base, don't you? Don't you want to be in sync with the communities of which you want to serve? You're probably not representing those, at least to the top of your organization or even the middle layers. So really thinking about organizations as key to solving the diversity problem, because we can create change much, much more quickly inside organizations, especially those growing organizations, the medium-sized organizations. But there's certainly some excellent examples, like the Salesforce story. And there's been several organizations that have really done this to do the right thing and to really appeal to their customer. And that belief system gets ingrained in the organization, and the C-suite acts in a way that's consistent with that belief system over time. And it just starts to hum, but it takes time. It still takes time. There's no, people love to ask me this question, like, what's the next big thing for diversity, or what's the trend, or the magic bullet is almost what people are asking me for. And there isn't one. There just isn't. It's not a check the box. It's not a one and done. This is a long game, and you've got to be committed to it long term, because back to what you said, that belief system, because it's the right thing to do.
And I think it's interesting. We know it's the right thing to do inherently. You and I can have this conversation rationally, but we know there are some people out there who aren't having this rational conversation. So what is it we can do from an outside to influence some of this? Because you mentioned about social change, doing it to organizations. You and I both work as coaches in different fields. So we're going into companies to do that. What is it we can do to influence that change from the outside? Are there steps? Are there things? Are there things we can say? What would listeners, thinking about listening to this podcast, what are the things they can do and notice and stand up for?
Yeah.
It just might make a change.
I get in my insular, diversity community, and I think everybody thinks this way. Yeah, you go spend time outside, and you're like, oh no, they're not on board with this. Oh,
Yeah.
okay. So you're right, and I think we're in a polarized environment. Unfortunately, people have politicized diversity, as into it's a liberal thing, or it's a human thing. This is not a political thing. Is how I usually start the conversation. And then, people have to be willing to listen. So you can't will somebody to change.
Mm.
I've had a number of unfortunate conversations with family members and people that just, despite their best efforts, don't get it and probably don't want to get it. So my coaching to people is don't spend time with the people that don't want to get it, because
Yeah.
you're just going to like ram your head into the wall and lose
Yeah.
your energy. And you're not going to sleep at night. Your mental health might suffer if you're like me last summer. It's like, how can you not get this? Where real opportunity is to spend time with the magic middle. So how I classify these folks these are people that want to get it, but don't get it yet. Right. They might have grown up like 75% of white people here in the United States live in white communities. That's a huge problem for obvious reasons. You're just not even given the exposure. And that's by design. We're kept away from each other on purpose. It's been redlined over the years and reinforced with property taxes. I could go on, but get exposure, right?
Yeah.
Get to know people that are different than you. So a very tangible thing to do for, well-intentioned allies in training is, reach out to people that are different ethnicities, races, gender identities, LGBTQ, like you name it, like just diversify who you spend time with.
Yeah.
You will see real tremendous change. And then use your voice. So oftentimes, somebody that wants to be a white ally for people of color, I'll just ask, like, what should I be doing more of? And there's certainly an education component to this, doing some due diligence, reading, listening to podcasts like this. But more importantly, they will say, speak up. Because when you speak up, Julie, there's something about the white face talking about anti-racism that just resonates with other white people. And like I say it, it's really like self-serving is how they see it from me, which is really frustrating that comes across, that we're still there where it seems self-serving. But for me, it's like, well, literally what skin in the game do I have? So it just gets attention when you speak up. And then the last thing I'd say is there's amazing voices out there, whether on social media or in just the media you consume in general. There's amazing people doing this work and speaking about this work and authoring books. Amplify the voices. If I see a great documentary or a great book, I'm always happy to share it on social media or like reading lists or, with a friend even. Amplify the work that's already being done. You don't have to create this wheel. There's plenty of people already out there. So I think sometimes we make that mistake as allies is we accidentally make it about us when we speak up. So leverage the work that's already being done. Chances are, I'll try to have a good thought from here and there, but I'll Google it and be like, oh yeah, someone already said that. Amplify that one, that person. Don't claim it for your own.
I love that. And it's a couple of things you mentioned about, you said about having skin in the game and speaking up, but the point you mentioned about amplifying the voice, because actually the world is making the right noises already in lots of areas. The world, whatever that means, the people out there doing it. And you're right. As I sit here as a white man, 50-year-old middle-class white man, whatever you want to call it, but actually amplifying it and promoting diversity and inclusion across everything we do as individuals and standing for something sounds to me the message you're saying there in terms of don't just stand back passively, but actually be active in promoting what you're hearing.
Well, and that's been a challenge with the term allies in general is unfortunately it's gotten misused over the years. I personally did a ton of research on the term before landing on it, and it was not a perfect term, but how it's been used as performative allyship in the past is like, much like you said, stand on the sideline, watch, I'll read my book, listen to my podcast, and then hide, and we've seen this here in the States. Globally, like look at what was happening in Black Lives Matter a year ago versus now. Who was, if you were attending protests and saying stuff on social media, getting woke, are you still awake? Where are you? Because I don't see a lot of activity. It's very unfortunate. And active allies is what we need. People that don't go away, that stay committed to this work, that remind themselves of the tenuous nature of it. And they keep using their voice. They keep speaking up.
And it's interesting actually to say about, you know, the active allies. I was marshalling a run on Saturday morning called Park Run in the UK, and I was one of the marshals, and there was, I don't know, 250, 300 people running around the park, which is something that happened 9 o'clock every Sunday morning. If anyone wants to go and get fit, join that park run. But there was a lady there with the Black Lives Matter t-shirt on, and it struck me because she stood out, just because she had it on. And I was thinking, actually, a year ago, a lot more people might have been having that on their t-shirts as well. So, you know, I don't know who this person was, but I saw it there, and I congratulate you for doing it. But in some ways, the human mind, we easily forget. And I think, you know, we always know that often people forget the good that's going on, and also forget the bad, because then that's why it reciprocates and comes back again. So I wonder whether there's something has to be done there to, you know, to really become active allies and go out of our way to look for opportunities. Because if we're just doing it passively, we may just miss it. So we've actually almost, there's got to be an active element to it, which is your active allies bit about it, is what I love what you said there. And I don't know how to do that, but I guess it's just a case of going out looking for it.
Yeah, I mean, it's really, again, self versus systems. Systems are hard to take down. I mean, your voice helps over time, but diversifying who you spend time with will build some natural connective tissue to this work, and that muscle to be more active, because you're going to have more people in your network that you care about that are different than you. And then it's that voice amplification and that education piece that I think just staying on the journey. I'm not asking you to join a book club, or, you know, actually that could be a performative allyship thing. For a lot of white women last summer, like, I'm going to have an anti-racism book club. Like, okay, have you invited people of color into that? And have you like sought out the right books? Because there's some problematic books. Anyway, I joke. But really, I think the more you educate yourself, you won't stay on the sidelines. And that could just be, you know, a podcast a month. There's some wonderful ones out there. And Phil, I'm happy to share this with you. There's a great resource list that we've curated over the years. Documentaries, podcasts, short videos, books. You know, it's a choose your own adventure as an ally. You know, some people learn by doing, some people learn by listening. Some people learn by discussing. Think about, how do you learn? And just pick one thing from the list, and just take some sort of action step. I think that can really, people just don't realize how big of a difference you can make in the world. You know, I'll have people that come back like 5 years after I've given a talk, and I'm in a different position, obviously, but, you know, 5 years later, they'll say, you know, I thought about the thing you said. I had a conversation with a person about this, and here's something that happened that fundamentally changed our relationship or this dynamic at work. So the amount of cascade effects that you can have on people by a conversation, like, I can't underscore that enough, because we feel powerless. We feel like I can't make a difference. But if everyone feels like that, then like, no one's going to make a difference. Like, you can stay with it.
I wrote a social media message last year sometime about a little girl walking along the beach, throwing starfish back into the sea. And the message was, she was confronted by a man who said, why are you throwing these starfish back in? There's hundreds of them here. What difference do you make? He said, I made a difference to that one life. And to me, that's the story of, you know, we can just help one person at a time. So I just want to get back in the story a bit, actually, and I want to come back to your resources. But how did you, as a white woman in America, get involved in this world, setting out, looking at allies? What was the trigger moment for you? Was it a trigger moment? Has it always been there? What happened to help you change and think differently?
Yeah, I appreciate that question. You know, everyone's kind of got their own diversity story, is what I call it. You know, how you find your way into this work, or when you wake up and see like, oh, wait, not everyone's like me, and maybe that's a good thing. And that I was fortunate enough to be raised by a single mother. And so I didn't see, from a gender perspective, honestly, within my home, I didn't see gender roles really growing up, right? She did everything from take out the trash to, you know, manage the budget to clean the house. So of course I saw those roles in school and the media and things, but within my home, I think I just had a much more open mindset around gender. Now, when I think it really when I woke up is when I went to college, in the Midwest.
Okay.
And they had a gender studies program, women's studies. And I remember learning about it and just how gender was socialized. Girls like dolls and boys play with action figures. And, I thought about just all the messages I learned about my gender over time. And I just really felt like this extra special sensitivity around like, that's just not fair.
Yeah.
And they actually, as a part of getting my minor in women's studies way back when, they made you take a cultural perspective course. So I took one on African women, and
Okay.
holy smokes, was that really eye-opening. And I'll never forget, like, the way it was taught was not to judge, because as Americans, we're like, ooh, they do this and they're so backwards. And like, that's super unhelpful. Instead, be curious about it. Instead, think about why their culture might be this way and
Yeah.
what you could do to be supportive. So all that to say, I went into corporate America. I thought, we're going to change everything. My mom was like, you can do anything, that message. And, you get to like day one in corporate America and you look around and it's 10 white guys and you in a leadership development program. You're like, world doesn't feel so equal. Like, what happened? And then it just kept happening and happening and happening. And, after 12 years, I was like, I'm exhausted. I'm just
Yeah.
sick of having to be a different version of myself. And I want more diversity in my life. And I want to feel a sense of belonging. And I loved what I did. I just didn't feel included. And
Wow.
so many people feel that way, unfortunately. And I just couldn't live my life that way. So that's when I started my business. It was a bit more focused on gender at the time.
Okay.
But then as I got more curious and compared notes with women of color, especially men of color,
Yeah.
much more likely to join the conversation around being an ally for women because they've had their own adverse experiences. So that whole path, kind of a bumble and a stumble along the way. And most recently, just deciding very much centered in our conversation and how we started is children,
Okay.
these kids deserve better. Like,
Yeah.
it's just not right. And my daughter's 7 and she's sharing some really unfortunate things that happen every single day. Kids of color being picked on in the classroom, boys saying girls can't do this. I mean, it happens so early. And I just really think this next generation, I don't want to kick the can to them. I want to give them the
Yeah.
tools, the resources that they need. So this conversation
Yeah.
pivots very frequently. And I think that's what you have to be willing to do as an ally, is to keep your ear to the ground, listen to what's happening, listen and think about how the world's changing and how your voice can help propel that change further.
And I think that bit about keeping your voice and looking at how you can propel that change further, I think is key, isn't it? And it's realizing that one person can make a difference, and you might as well be that person, or I might as well be that person. Doesn't matter.
Exactly. Well, might as well be me.
Yeah. And you've got your screen backdrop on. I can see your book, Little Allies. And so tell me a bit about that, because that's aimed at children and helping how they can go along and drive this inclusion and diversity. Tell me a bit about that book in that case, because I think that's a key fundamental about starting early.
Oh, yeah. You have to have the tools and resources. So we've got this big debate going on here in our local school system. A lot of school systems are wrestling with this. There's this backlash of like, we can't teach our kids critical race theory. And there's a podcast called the 1619 Project that has all these parents up in flames. It's very strange because it's not actually a curriculum for starters. But all that to say this, at the time we need to embrace diversity at the same time when, again, it's being polarized. And what I found just in conversations with other parents, caregivers, educators, I host a podcast called the Inclusion School Podcast with my friend Simone. And we were interviewing people, school teachers, principals, book authors, and just like, what do we need to do to prepare this next generation to embrace diversity and inclusion? And, we got a lot of the same answers. And I was like, well, how are we teaching them like how to be like an ally? Like, how, if they're like my daughter, a white girl, like how does she show up in this conversation? Because she just doesn't know. And so that was the inspiration for the book Little Allies. Is I didn't know what to say to my daughter. So I'm sure there were a lot of parents that didn't know what to say. I mean, I still don't know what to say. I'm not perfect. I'm not an authority on the subject, but I do know what works with adults. And really, honestly, the book is really for adults to read. It's just got short little stories about things that happen in the schools, like in her school day. And the main character, Allie, kind of comes to a realization at the end about uniqueness and differences and how to be there for kids that are different than us. And the book has a discussion guide and an ally pledge so that they can Parents can interact with their kids about it and make it more of a discussion, because secret is that parents actually learn more from the conversation than the kids do. I mean, my daughter, after reading it, was like, Mom, most books are just silly stories. This one's about life. So we had a really good conversation that I wouldn't have been able to have had we not had a tool, had we not had that resource. So that's the hope, is to give back in this way, because I know we're wrestling with this conversation and when to start it and how to have it. And it can just be an open conversation. And if you stay curious with your kiddo, they will teach you something, I promise.
I love that about staying curious. And actually, I believe I've learned more from my 15-year-old and 18-year-old about inclusion and diversity, in terms of all sorts, ranging from LGBTQ plus and racial inclusion. It's just been an amazing journey for me to learn it from them. And what I've noticed about the children that I know closely is they take it in their stride.
Mm-hmm.
It's normal. Now, I may be in a privileged position to see it from my two girls. Other people may not see it that way, but I think actually the younger people today are seeing that. But I love the fact you've got a book there which educates, and actually probably educates the adults more. And I think there's a thing there in terms of, helping people to show up differently and helping use that curiosity as a mindset.